So, friends and colleagues, it's really fantastic for me to be back here and be back on an opportunity, on an occasion like this, and to see so many old friends here is a particular privilege. I've been sort of, in reflective mood, and if you look around, I think in society generally, we tend to have more parties, but we tend to have fewer ceremonies. And inaugural lectures are sort of one of the few residual ceremonial remains of a past age. They mark something important. They mark something maybe even profound, which is they mark dedication to scholarship and commitment to the community of learning. And that's something worth having a ceremony about. It's something worth celebrating. The title professor has that slightly comedic tinge in the UK, but somehow it references something unworldly. It goes with the common use of the word academic to refer to something which is completely useless. Something which even now, turning a little time outside academia, I still resent. Being a professor is special, and it's deservedly so. Many people around here know what it takes to get there and recognise the achievement. And that achievement is the mastery necessary to profess the subject. That's what being a professor is about. And it's important. It marks a vocation. So we're very pleased to share this ceremony with Licia, with friends and with family, or family and friends. You can't both, Licia. Licia is, I think everybody here knows, an amazing person. I think I knew that the moment she walked into Wolfgang and my lab. She came, of course, recommended, but her characteristic quiet self-possession and determination just radiated from her as it radiates from her now. And she proceeded with Wolfgang's guidance and support to undertake excellent work which continues to this day. But though I saw her do excellent work, I think that I saw her in a new light when I saw her preparing and delivering the compilers course. Now, many of you here will know that compilers is a really difficult subject to teach because people don't quite know why they're studying it, and yet it is at the core of so much of what we've achieved in computer science, and marks in some ways an engineering high point. But in that things, you could see her organisation, her drive to clarity, and her conscientiousness. And as always, you really see the professor in the making when you see them teach. I've sought on various occasions to give Licia advice. Not advice she needed, just advice. And I now recognise that the only useful thing that I did in the entire process was to play a small supporting role in bringing her and Luca together. She listens politely to me on various occasions, but did what a genuine academic should. She pursued her star and her own unique vision of the subject. I think we can see that this vision that lies at the conjunction of social computing and mobility and software infrastructures and just a small admixture of software engineering is really the subject for pursuit now within computer science. Her talk today is on urban computing, and I think I don't think I need to emphasise in this audience the importance and significance and resonance of that topic. I was quite struck by a comment made to me by David Gann, who was at Imperial College, and he said about UCL. He said London is more important than the UK, and I think that's a truth. That we are moving into a situation in which these large global cities are going to play a central role. Indeed, one might say that the city might play an economic and social role that maps across to the role that the state played in the formation of Europe and so on. And so it's very appropriate that we focus our technological consideration on that topic, and we think about what we as computer scientists can do. It's a great pleasure then to invite Licia to give her inaugural lecture.
Thank you, Anthony. Yes, many thanks, Anthony, for the very nice introduction. And now you've seen me with the gown, you'll see me without. Because it's really uncomfortable. Okay, so what I would like to do in this talk is give you an overview of research I've been doing over the years in the area of urban computing. But before doing that, I would like to step back just for a moment and tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from, because this might explain my interest and fascination for cities. So this is my home village in the northeast of Italy. It's a very small rural village called Belricetto of just 400 people. And you need to travel 65, 70 kilometers northwest in order to reach the first main city of Bologna. And Belricetto, like many other villages in that part of Italy, doesn't offer that many services. It has a church, it has a very big coffee shop, a few basic services and shops, and then miles and miles of fields. It's an agricultural area. And this is where I've been living for the first 24 years of my life. I did study for 5 years in Bologna to pursue my MH degree in computer science, but I was commuting on a daily basis. And then in 2000, when I finally got my degree, I decided that I wanted to move away from rural life. And that's when I moved right into this massive metropolitan city of London. And the vision I had then, I guess, is the same vision that many people that are moving from rural to urban life had. The idea of having better quality of life. And the ability to have easy access to fundamental services like good quality education, like healthcare, like telecommunication, like public transport, and so on. And London has certainly delivered, at least to me, on all those fronts. But I've also realized that there are lots of complexities and challenges living in cities. So stay in London for just a few weeks or a couple of months, and you realize how massively overloaded the public transportation network is, and how uncomfortable and difficult it is to travel sometime. Also, stay for a little bit longer, say a few months or a couple of years, change flat a few times, and you realize how quality of life is really not equally and evenly distributed across areas. And you may find the two areas next to each other scoring very differently, for example, in terms of life expectancy or GCSE scores. Now, stay for even a bit longer, and then you try to buy a property to live in, and then you realize how difficult it is to access housing services. And as citizens realize and perceive that well-being is so unevenly distributed, and the more they think that government is not doing enough to tackle these issues, then the most likely outcome is social unrest. So for quite a few years, I've been interested in trying to see how we could help manage this very complex and massive urbanization process, so to be able really to deliver better quality of life to citizens. And urbanization is not a new process. It has been studied by very many different disciplines for decades, from architecture to anthropology to geography. But I believe that in the last 10 years or so, also computer science has had a lot to say in this domain. And the main change came about thanks to the vast amount of data and information that we are sensing about our cities, the functioning of our cities, and the behavior of our citizens. And that we can then extract knowledge from this data to then be able to provide new services and functions to really improve quality of life. Now, where is this data coming from? Lots of different sources. For example, from the RFID card that most of us carry in our pockets and that we use whenever we want to access the public transportation network. From the mobile phones we carry with us and that we engage with through a variety of mobile applications that we have installed on them. To this new generation of sensing devices that we place in our cars, in our homes, we embed in buildings, we wear on our wrist, and so on. So there is lots of knowledge that we can extract from these data sources to then build services for citizens. So what I would like to do in the first part of this talk is give you 3 examples of research I've been doing around this domain, where I've been using data, these examples of data, in order to learn about the functioning of our cities, in order to plan the construction of cities, and also in order to help regulate the functioning of our cities. So let me begin with the first thing. What do we want to learn about the functioning of our cities? Well, one piece of information that I've been interested in for quite some time is being able to assess the level of socio-economic deprivations in different areas of our cities. And I think this is a really important piece of information for local authorities, for policymakers, for governments, because having access to this kind of information means that we can make strategic decisions on how we want to allocate, for example, regeneration funds. Now, how do we currently quantify socioeconomic deprivation of areas? Well, in the UK, the Office of National Statistics releases every 4 or 5 years a set of indices about the deprivation of areas. In terms of income deprivation, employment deprivation, health deprivation, and so on. And also an aggregate index, which is a weighted average of all these factors. So just to give you an idea, for the city of London, every 5 years we compute this index and we get information at this level of spatial granularity. So tiny small census areas called lower layer super output areas, or LSOAs. Now, this is very useful, so the darker the color of the area here, the higher the level of socioeconomic deprivation as computed by these indices. Now, this is very useful data, I believe, for governments, but the process of getting this data comes with problems. One being that it is a very costly and timely effort to collect, aggregate, and then release this information. So this data comes around only 5 years or so. And now you may wonder, well, are things changing really so fast for London and the UK that we need to have access to this information more frequently? And actually we do. Because if we look, for example, at the difference of IMD published in 2010 and IMD published 2015, we see that there have been quite a lot of changes happening. So you have nearby areas, some of which have improved. The bluer the area, the better off they've become in a 5-year time. The redder the area, the worse off they've been evolving. So we would really like to have access to this information more frequently. And this is perhaps not that important for developed cities and countries like in London or the UK, but it's of paramount importance for developing countries. Because in those places, the urbanization process is happening very fast, so changes are massive year to year. And in those countries, the way socioeconomic assessment is done is still by means of surveys and census. So these are very costly processes. So what really happens in some of these developing countries is that you get these estimates once every 10 years or longer, and also at a very coarse level of spatial granularity. So what I've been interested in for a few years is can we actually use these data sources that we have, let's say for free, in order to be able to identify accurately socioeconomic deprivation at a fine level of spatio-temporal granularity. And in particular, what source of data should we be looking at? Now, the idea here that we had was to look at flow of people. The reason being that there had been a number of studies showing that if we look at macro scale, so movement of people across countries, there had been a number of studies showing that the flow of people between countries was restricted by socioeconomic deprivation. So now the idea here was, okay, maybe the same will hold if we now look at microscale, so within a single country or even within different regions within a city. So the idea that we had was, well, we needed to have access to information about flow of people within cities, and then we may see whether this flow is somehow restricted. This might be a signal for us to pick up to then estimate economic deprivation. So where did we get information about the flow of people? From the Oyster card. Okay, so we teamed up with Transport for London, and we got detailed records of how people moved within the public transportation network in London. And although we did this study for London, you can imagine replicating it for a number of cities across the world. So what was the starting hypothesis we had there? That the flow of people between, say, pair of stations or pair of areas is restricted by deprivation. So first of all, we computed the actual flow between areas, and we used Oyster card data in order to do that. So then we knew exactly how many people were traveling between pairs of areas. Then we needed a model to estimate flow. And again, here we were inspired by previous studies which had shown how we could model flow at macro level between countries. So what we did was use deep gravity models to say, okay, the flow of people between pair of areas should be somehow proportional to the number of people living in those areas and inversely proportional to distance. Now, we studied the correlations between the estimates made by our model and actual data, and we found to be that there was a very strong signal, very strong correlation. But also, so above 0.7 Pearson correlation. But crucially, also, there was a proportion of traffic that we could not estimate from the model. So the intuition we had there was that in cases where our model was overestimating actual flows, those were possibly areas of socioeconomic deprivation. And then we went into defining a number of metrics to capture these restrictions. So, for example, we computed metrics for each areas in London, looking at the average, the mean error we did in estimating flows, the mean standard deviation. We also looked, for example, at the proportion of travels done by bus versus trains and so on. Now, without going too much into the details of the specific metrics we computed, what we then did was build models and use this model to see whether we could classify economic deprivation for different regions of London. So we built these classifiers, we trained on a subset of data points around London, see if we could accurately estimate deprivation. And again, as I said, without going too much into the details, what we were able to find is if we look at the composite index, so the aggregate index of multiple deprivation, we were able to accurately estimate or classify deprived areas roughly 80% of the time. So this, for us, was a starting point in the direction of using data to estimate socioeconomic deprivation. But as I mentioned before, really what we were interested in doing is the same, but for developing countries. So what we then did was team up with the United Nations Global Pulse Lab and the Population Fund and focus on a select number of countries, which were the Ivory Coast, Senegal, and then a region in India. And in this case, we didn't really have access to Oyster card data or a public transportation network, but there we followed exactly the same idea we had. But rather than studying flow of people, we analyzed the flow of information as captured by telecommunication data. Now, you go to these countries and you find that everybody has a mobile phone. We were able to access information about what regions or what antennas were calling what other antennas for long periods of time. So the very same idea we used in order to capture signals about economic deprivation. We were able to replicate results across these three different countries and also quantify the advantage that these techniques bring relative to state-of-the-art approaches. And again, just to give you an intuition of the kind of things we were able to do, what you have on the left is a picture of the Ivory Coast with information about economic deprivation as they currently computed. So this is data that is computed roughly every 10 years at this level of spatial granularity. Okay, so you can understand how difficult it is to plan interventions and funds allocation based on this information. With the method we are developing, what we can learn is economic deprivation at this level of spatial granularity. And we can do that every 6 months or every year, repeatedly over time, basically at no extra cost. So this is the first case of operating on already available data to learn about the functioning of our city. Now let's imagine that we have identified in one of these countries an area that we want to intervene and plan some interventions, create a new neighborhoods or areas where we want communities to flourish, okay? Where we want people to feel safe, where we want well-being to be high, and so on. Now, there are lots of theories we can go about on how to develop this kind of settlements. And urbanists have developed these theories over very long periods of time. But sometimes it's quite difficult to understand how to go about it. The reason being that sometimes these theories might appear to contradict each other. So, for example, you have some theories which are suggesting the construction of open spaces with mixed land use, so to attract a variety of different peoples throughout the course of a day. And the idea is that in this case, people coming through will act as eyes on the street, and there will be some sort of natural surveillance that will keep crime low. But then you might have somehow almost the opposite theory, saying that actually all this movement of people coming through creates actually anonymity, which will make then crime appear more strongly. And then in this case, you have theories advocating for single-purpose areas with well-defensible spaces. So which one should we go about? Also, you have theories advocating for the construction of so-called towers in the park areas, so very high-rise and dense areas, new blocks of flats. But at the same time, you have other theories which are instead advocating for the preservation of historical city centers with low-rise constructions and less density. So once again, how do we go about it? And I believe one of the reasons why we have these appearingly contradicting theories is that it's very difficult to validate these theories at scale. So often what you find in the literature is studies that have been done at a fairly small, for fairly small areas, so neighborhoods in cities rather than at city scale. Very rarely you study a whole city or a multitude of cities to see how broadly these theories apply. And even more rarely have these theories been studied repeatedly over time to see how they evolve. So the question that we started asking ourselves is, how can we help? I mean, with all the data that we have available about our cities and the usage of our cities, can we actually help urbanists and architects to evaluate their theories at scale? And we thought we could do that because, as I mentioned before, we have lots of data about our cities. For example, this is an OpenStreetMap. So we have information about the morphology of our cities in terms of street networks, for example, and functions and services within cities. We also have information about usage of cities through all these social media applications that we use in, for example, to check in to a variety of places. So we have both static and, say, dynamic information about cities. Also, cities around the world, from London to New York, are increasingly releasing open data sets describing a variety of indicators about the well-being of cities. I was showing you before the index of multiple deprivation, but we also have indicators in terms of well-being, crime, and so on and so forth. So the idea we had was that, well, first of all, what we can do is, let's start from the theories, okay? What have people identified as important factors that are linked to well-being in cities? And we found three main lines of work. There is information about the street network that is linked to well-being, housing information, and functions information about services which are available in cities. So what we did, starting from these theories, we thought, okay, what kind of metrics can we automatically extract from ready available data set that will capture these theories? So at the level of street network, we computed, for example, network connectivity, network density, the regularity of the grid. In terms of housing information, we were computing, for example, the proportion in a given neighborhood of flats versus detached or semi-detached houses and so on. In terms of functions, we were computing what kind of mix of, and variety of services we have in a given area. So what we did was we started by computing all these metrics per different spatial unit of analysis. And then we started an exploratory analysis, trying to understand the correlations between these different metrics and a variety of well-being indicators, be that economic deprivation, gang crime, well-being, child obesity, life expectancy. These are some of the indicators we studied. And after this exploratory analysis, we started to identify which metrics were best capturing the theories. And then we developed more comprehensive models and then started building classifiers to see whether, for example, by training this classifier on a certain city, we could then estimate any of these indicators for other cities. So we did study quite a few urban areas across the UK, from London to Birmingham to Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle, and so on. And rather than going into the details of numerical results, I just wanted to give you an intuition of what we were able to do. So what you see on the left is an example of an area that falls into the bottom quartile of IMD. So this is a well-off area. And this is instead an area that falls in the top quartile of IMD, of economic deprivation, so a highly deprived areas. And what we were able to see here was actually theories that advocate for high network density and inorganic grid layout would seem to be linked to economic wealth as opposed to areas, for example, where there are lots of cul-de-sacs and so on. Now, the important bit here is not really what theories hold where. That was not really our purpose. Really, what we were trying to do here was to try and build tools and services that would help urbanists to validate their theories and possibly refine them across different areas around the world and over time. Now, and for this line of work, we did have access to well-established theories to start from. But sometimes we are not that lucky. Sometimes what happens is that there is a new phenomenon happening that is strongly disrupting the functioning of our cities. And cities are required to react and adapt and sometimes reinvent themselves. And this, I believe, was the case, or is being the case, with the advent of the sharing economy or the peer-to-peer economy. A situation where all of a sudden we have cities and individuals sharing with others their own resources from, for example, their time, their skills, their money, their private cars, their spare room in their properties, and so on and so forth. Now, you may read almost on a daily or weekly basis a news article about the sharing economies. You will have proponents of this model, as they will advocate that it's good for everyone because it's just a way of generating more income that will then be redistributed around the cities to the advantage of everyone. And then you will read the opposite argument from detractors of the sharing economy that will say, no, actually, this is just a way for individuals to make money without paying taxes. Okay? So it was the case, for example, on one hand, there was the taxi industry, which is very well regulated, and all of a sudden we had the services like Uber and the BlaBlaCar. Similarly, in terms of housing, hospitality, sorry, on one hand we had the hotel industry, and then all of a sudden we started having services like Airbnb. So governments are required to take actions, right, to regulate these kind of services, and they don't have, and this is something fundamentally new, that they don't really know how to go about it. So what we have observed is that in some cases these services have been completely banned, and then in some other cases they have been let grow without any regulation. But what has not happened much yet is actually trying to understand quantitatively where are these services growing, where are they flourishing, and how are they evolving over time. And we should be really doing that, be able to do that, because we have data available, not just for one city, but for lots of different cities around the world about how these services are popping up and growing. And this is an example of Airbnb presence across 4 different countries. So the point is that from this data, if we can build the models about this kind of services growth and evolution, then we may use this data to regulate these services. So this is a very new line of work that we have been pursuing. We have, for now, tried to answer two sub or smaller questions, which are, can we understand under what condition there is Airbnb presence, and can we understand how this presence evolves over time? And as I was mentioning before, in this case, we don't really have that many theories to go about. So in trying to understand what factors determine Airbnb appearance and growth, we basically had to be a bit creative and look at other fields for inspiration. So what did we think could be linked to Airbnb growth? Well, certainly geographic information. So you might expect that the closer you are to the city center, the more demand and offer for Airbnb houses and flats there is going to be. The closer you are to touristic attractions, the more demand there will be for these kind of places. But we also thought that the composition of the demographics composition of an area might be important. So if you think that perhaps it's more for younger people to engage in this kind of internet-enabled services, then we may want to have a look at the proportion of young people there. What kind of jobs do they do there? There have been other studies, urban studies, that have linked, for example, the value of properties in areas to the kind of jobs that people have, whether they're, for example, in the creative industries or not. So that is another piece of information that we tried to capture. And then, of course, in general, housing information. So what is the proportion of owned or versus rented properties? What is their average value, and so on? So we compiled a fairly broad list of metrics that we wanted to capture. And then we started engaging into, again, this is a kind of exploratory analysis, trying to understand which of these factors seem to be linked to Airbnb offerings, so people putting their place up for share, demand, so people wanting to go to these places, as well as price. And as I mentioned before, because this data is available for basically any city around the world where there is Airbnb presence, we could actually do comparative analysis, and we studied 8 different cities in the US, as well as the city of London. So what we wanted to do then is, once we had identified the metrics that seemed to be most relevant, and we put them all together in models that we then used, for example, to say, what if I train on this number of cities? Will I be able to predict Airbnb penetration and growth for another? Now, I'm going to show you results for just one city, which is close to my heart, which is London. What we did in this case was an exploration into this kind of analysis for different years. And I would like to focus your attention on just a few data points. So at the very beginning, in 2012, where are we having Airbnb presence? Mainly in areas which are close to the city center, so negative correlations to distance from the center, quite expected. And also where there is a high proportion of young people. No surprises here. But now, let's start looking at what happens as we progress over time. So Airbnb is no longer confined in the city center where hotels are, but actually it's starting to move away. Distance from the center, it doesn't play such a big role anymore. And instead, what we have is that it keeps growing where there is a higher proportion of young people, which are income deprived, or anyway, where the income deprivation is higher. And quite interestingly, where there is a higher proportion of rented places rather than owned, which might hint to the fact that there might be some illegal subletting going on. Now, we are not really at a stage to say, okay, now we can build policies out of this data. But this information may be quite useful. For example, if the City of London decided to engage in schemes whereby, for example, it gave rights to homeowners to engage in this kind of short-term rental, how would we use this information? Well, for example, to identify in what areas to give this kind of rights, because we wanted to move away from a city where all the tourists are crumbled in the city center, and we may want to spread them out. At the same time, we may want to control how many nights each individual or each area is supposed to be engaging with in this kind of short-term rentals, because too much of these, and then we will destroy the social fabric of an area, which is going to take them decades to recover. So as we build confidence in the future, in the validity of these models, we might actually foresee a future where policy making will be done algorithmically on this kind of data. And this is scary because if we keep following this line of research, then there are some important questions that we need to ask ourselves. So first of all, do we have the right data to quantify quality of life in cities, or are we missing something that is fundamentally important here? Also, we collect data for a purpose because, for example, we may want to change our behavior, because we may want to build policies, because we may want to plan interventions. But are people really engaged with the data that we've been collecting, or is it only the field for some data scientists to play with? So what I would like to do in the second part of this talk is give you an overview of two new lines of work that I've been following, where we are moving focus from trying to build smart city services to trying instead to engage citizens more. So let me start from the first question we had. Do we have the right data in order to quantify quality of life in cities? So first of all, let's have a look at what kind of data we are focusing on and we are collecting at the moment. So if we look at a variety of smart data initiatives around the world, you'll see that there is a high focus on environmental data or factual information about the functioning of our cities. So we have a variety of sensors that we use in order to acquire information about air quality, about water quality, about the movement of cars, so we can plan traffic, or the availability of parking spots, so we can easily find parking spaces. But what is missing from this picture? We know near nothing about how citizens feel. So how are Londoners today? Do they feel happy or sad? Do they feel connected or isolated? What is their opinion about a new policy that is being rolled out? What do they think about a new shopping mall that is being put up in place, for example, of an older community center? We don't have access to this information, and yet the more we talk to governments and authorities and policymakers, the more we realize that actually this is incredibly important information that they would like to have access to. So how do they currently access this information? Well, for example, they might create online surveys and distribute them to people, but we know that there is a big issue in terms of getting lots of answers, and sometimes these surveys are only relevant to a local group of people. The alternative is to actually perhaps go on the streets and stop people and passers-by in order to ask their opinions, but if you are anything like me, whenever you see one of these people, you start walking away and going about your business. So 3.5 years ago, we started a new research center, which is a collaboration between Intel, Imperial College, and UCL, with a specific goal of trying to design new technologies that will engage a citizen in giving us their opinions and feelings and perspectives. And this required, for me, a completely different approach to what I've shown you before. Because now we were going about designing new technologies that didn't exist. So it required, starting from building low-fidelity prototypes about what this technology might look like, starting deploying them in small settings and see how people would approach it and appropriate it, then going back in the lab and then use a variety of 3D printing, laser cutting, Internet of Things technologies, building higher fidelity prototypes, and then starting deploying it repeatedly in a variety of settings for an extended period of time in order to see how people would engage with this technology. And then, from these repeated deployments, see if we could derive really guidelines for how to build this kind of new sensing devices. So, I'd like to give an overview of a series of projects we have done in terms of getting people's opinion and data. Starting from a very small project we did a few years ago that I guess some of you might remember. So we started with a very simple question, which was, what is the color of your mood today? And then we built 4 or 5 boxes with an Arduino chip inside, and then a number of squeeze balls that we could squeeze in order to express what was the color of our mood. And then this data was being collected, and you could have a look online, as well as a visualization on the 6th floor about how we felt. And you see Anthony here engaging with the technology the day we rolled it out. So I don't know if you remember these, but I remember very clearly some of the reactions we got. So some people said, there is absolutely no scientific grounding to the question you're asking, and I absolutely refuse to squeeze any of your balls. Fair enough. But then, actually, most of the people were actually quite intrigued, and they were confused by the ambiguity of the question, and they started discussing with one another what kind of mapping they were doing between color and mood. Also, there was something in the physicality and the playfulness of the technology that quite attracted people, and quite a few of them reported stopping by whenever they were walking by the foyer on the floor to go and squeeze the color of their mood. Even though some other people actually said that it was perhaps a bit too playful to be placed in a workplace, so they would approach the balls, and if they realized that someone else was there, they would just change direction and avoid doing that. Now, this was just an initial exploration into the technology, but we already started having some important findings. One, the importance of asking ambiguous questions, because sometimes these are really good to trigger a reflection and discussion among people, which is something we wanted if we want to get people's opinions and perceptions. The other thing was that there was something unique in the playfulness and the physicality of the input devices, which naturally attracted people. We didn't have to chase them to ask how they felt. They naturally wanted to go there and interact with this technology. So what we did was take these lessons and then started building a full-scale tangible questionnaire, which we called VoxBox. Now, in this case, we were not asking one question only. We were asking a full range of questions. And VoxBox was mainly designed to ask people's opinions when they engaged in events, in festivals, exhibitions, and so on. So the questions we focused at the beginning were comprised both demographics information and as well as experiential. And we started playing around not only with one input modality, squeezing, but with a variety of input modalities. So for example, buttons and sliders and dials, phone, and so on and so forth. It was built in a very modular way, so that it would have actually been possible, for example, to slot in more questions or change the order or customize them. And in fact, we've been deploying VoxBox in more occasions that honestly I can remember. And so we started off with the Tour de France festival, as it started in London a couple of years ago. Then we used it for a digital democracy festival. A couple of months ago, we took it up in the orbit at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Parks. Now, across all these deployments, we realized that what we observed is that we never ever had to ask people to go and interact with it. People always walked to it and approached it in their own terms. We were able to attract people of very different demographics, and not just individuals, but couples, families, a group of friends discussing with one another before actually responding to this technology. So intrigued by this success for us, when we became even more ambitious. And then we started asking ourselves, well, actually, can we use something similar, a similar technology, to engage very different audience, like children? So we often put up events and activities for children, and we would like to know what they remember about this, how they are perceived. And it's difficult to get data because there is always the mediating interference of parents, and while we would like to have direct information from them. So again, we took this idea of tangible, physical, and playful devices in order to see whether we could get their opinions as well. And also, we started thinking, well, what if instead of asking experiential information about events, we also started asking some, I wouldn't say more serious, but more personal and sensitive questions. For example, linked to the UK census, how people feel about issues of public policy, of health, of safety, and so on and so forth. And I think that across board, this is a series of projects in which we've been quite successful in really engaging citizens, donating or giving us their soft data. But this is only one of the two questions I said that we had before. Yes, on one hand, we want to make sure that we get the right data for our inquiries. But the other half of the question is, how do we know whether we're getting the data right? So is everything stopping at the data collection point? Or actually, should we go ahead and should we make sure that people are actually engaged with the data we are collecting, they are understanding what it means, After all, we are collecting data for a purpose, be that behavior change or so on. So this is really a new area of research we have only started a year ago, and we will be pursuing for the next few years. But already I would like to give you a flavor of something that we've been able to do in this domain. So we narrowed it down quite substantially, and we focused on one of the pieces of information that most smart cities initiatives seem to be interested in, and that is environmental data. So there are lots of sensing devices available. One fairly popular one is a Smart Citizen. This is a board that was funded through a Kickstarter campaign a few years ago. And it is a board which contains sensors about, for example, light, humidity, temperature, CO2, NO, and so on and so forth. And it's a device that private individuals are supposed to buy and place in their houses. It's a very cheap device and you use for your personal use. And this device comes with, so it gets this data, and then if you want to have a look at the environmental conditions, for example, say within your house, what you can then do is you can go online and you can select in what the kind of sensor you're interested in, noise, humidity, and so on. And then basically what you see is a time series of the data that is being sensed. Now, we went back to these backers of the Kickstarter campaign who had one Smart Citizen and tried and explored to what extent they were engaging with the collected data. So were they making sense of it? Were they changing their behavior inside the house for that? And what we found was that nobody was ever looking at this data source. Okay, so everything stopped at the data collection point. And there are many different reasons for that. But you can already identify a couple of these. One is you have this complete disconnect between sensing and sense-making. So you sense information in the environment, and then if you want to know what the value of these sensors are, you have to open your laptop or mobile phone, go on a website and check this. Okay? So there's a complete disconnect between what you're sensing and where you need to go and look to understand what kind of data you have been sensing. Also, we found that quite a lot of people were really not interested in this time series of data. It was meaningless to them. But when they saw some of these spikes, they wanted to know what was going on there. Okay. So inspired by these two facts, we then started exploring what kind of technology we could build in order to facilitate sense-making. And then what we built was a toolkit called PhysiKit. And the two fundamental ideas behind PhysiKit are the following. One is that we want to visualize data in a physical manner, right at the point of data collection. So we developed a number of what we call PhysiCubes, which are physical representation of data. We developed four, one which was emitting light, one which was vibrating, one which had a rotation pattern, one which was emitting air, and so on. And so these are physical representation of data. And then what we developed also was a web-based tool that enabled people to express what kind of data they were interested in and how it should be mapped onto any of these cubes. So it would allow people to say, for example, I'm interested in when humidity goes above 70%. When that happens, start vibrating. Okay. Or, for example, I might be interested in when the average sound that I've been sampling over the past half hour exceeds a certain threshold. Maybe my kids are being too loud. In that case, I want to start flashing some light, and so on. Now, in terms of input, in this case, we focused on data that was coming out of Smart Citizen, but in theory, any data source, data sensors could be our input. So this is what the developed product looked like in the end. So these are the PhysiCubes that we've been developing. This is the configuration tool. So what did we do? For now, we've only had the time to do one study, where what we did was with 5 different families. To begin with, we gave them a Smart Citizen kit. So they deployed it in their house, and they had access to this web-based tool in order to see what was happening in their houses. And 1 week was enough to completely disconnect and never look at the website again. Then we intervened, and we gave to each of these families a set of cubes. And we let them use for a couple of weeks. So even though this study is preliminary and we're only at the very beginning, what we did find was that people placed these objects in strategic positions inside their houses. So they didn't have to go anywhere else to have a look at what was happening. The cube was right there at the point of sensing and sense-making where action had to be taken. Also, what we found was that there was quite a lot of engagement with the configuration tool, so that people were started playing around in terms of rules that they were interested in and what they wanted to be visualized. So this is just an initial study, and we are planning on, we are working towards a physics version 2 or 3, I'm not even sure what version we are at now, with the idea of playing with different form factors in terms of visualization, as well as considering different demographics groups where we can deploy this technology. So this is certainly part of my future work, but more broadly speaking, where do I see my research going for the next few years? Now, if I had to pinpoint 2 questions that I think we haven't paid enough attention yet, these would be my 2 questions. One is we need to pay more attention and analyzing who is contributing the data we are analyzing, because linked to these are questions of accuracy, trustworthiness in the data, representativeness of the data, and so on. And also, who gets access to this data. It's rarely the case that the data we analyze is raw data, and it undergoes a series of transformation and manipulation that we need to be aware of. So if I had to be a bit more precise, then these are my top 3 priorities for the next few years. One is understanding, quantifying, and acting upon bias in the data. So a lot of the data we are analyzing comes from volunteers, and it may come with a lot of bias. So we need to develop, we've started some work in terms of quantifying different forms of bias in these sources, but we also need to be able to visualize it, remove it or reduce bias, possibly with algorithmic techniques, but whereas this is not possible, with interventions right at the source, so that actually we reduce bias at the collection point. Second is tackling issues of data provenance. So it's rarely the case, as I was mentioning just a minute ago, that the data that we analyze is the data we collected. Data usually goes through different hands, and it undergoes processes of aggregation, anonymization, transformation. Now, if we are going towards the case of having data-driven policy making, then we need to understand this chain of transformation if we want to be made accountable for decisions being made upon this data. And last but not least, as I was mentioning in the last example of work I've shown you, user engagement. I think we've been fairly successful in terms of engaging user at the point of data entry, so at the point of sensing. But when it comes to sense-making, we are only at the very beginning, and we need to be able to reach a broader audience and also engage them in a richer interaction. So for physics, for example, at the moment it was the case of one data source with one user or one family. But what happens when we're actually dealing with resources which are shared among different people, so that the decisions I make about certain behaviors will actually have to be considered in conjunction with the behaviors of many others? Can we actually help sense-making and decisions-making at this collective level? Also, the kind of engagement we are looking for, both in terms of data collection and in terms of sense-making, in the end, will have to be sustained over much longer periods of time than what we have been able to evaluate so far. And this is fundamentally different also in terms of research. How do we even create studies that will enable us to answer this question? But just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it. Okay, and with that I would like to conclude my talk. And I think that, hold on a minute, I think that procedure now will see that there is going to be a vote of thanks about me. But first, I would like to take just a few more minutes for me thanking some people. So I've been at UCL for a very long period of time. And I've always been proud of being part of these institutions, from my academic colleagues to to the research fellows I've been working with, PhD students, undergraduate students, support staff. So a massive thank to everyone. But then there are a few people that I would really like to give an extended thank. Starting with Wolfgang and Anthony. You probably don't remember this, but this week marks an anniversary for us. Because it was exactly 16 years ago, this week, I think on Tuesday, that I moved from Italy to come to London and joined the software systems engineering group that you were leading at that point. I had no clue what it meant doing research at that point, and just after a couple of weeks I was here, you took me to ICSI, the most prestigious software engineering conference in our field, and that got me hooked. That's September that year, I started doing research. I started working as a PhD student in your team, and since then you've been academic fathers, mentors, friends, and a massive thanks for all this. You've also been probably the most generous head of research groups that one could wish for, because quite a few in the audience might have asked, where is software engineering in there? And I realized that I don't do mainstream software engineering research, and yet you let me go wherever I wanted to go. And also David Rosenblum after you, and Mark Harman now. You've just been the most generous head of research groups that I could possibly wish, so thanks. So after doing my PhD, I did a move. I stayed at UCL, did a couple of years of postdocs, and then in 2005, I started as an academic. And then especially in the last couple of years, I had a number of junior colleagues asking me for advice on, okay, how do you go from being a lecturer to becoming a professor? And I don't really have much advice to give other than recount my own experience. And the only thing I would say is find yourself the best collaborators possible and work with them, because they will keep inspiring you over the years, they will keep challenging you over the years, and it doesn't matter if you remain in the same institution or not, as long as you form these stronger collaborations. And sometimes you have to travel all over the world to find these collaborators. And then in some other cases, you just have to walk 2 doors down your corridor to find them. And this is what happened to me. So Steve and Yvonne, you've been amazingly inspiring mentors, and there's so much I've been learning from you that I don't really know where to begin to thank you. But if I were to distill 2 really important lessons I've learned from you is, 1, work on really important problems that will matter to society. And take risks when trying to solve these big problems, while also having fun as you go about fixing them. Last but not least, all the works that I've shown you and discussed with you in the last hours have all been done in collaborations with other people. None of the papers that you've seen before had my name only on them. So from my PhD students, some of which I'm really glad to have here today, to a research fellow. It's been an honor to be able to work with you over the years, and I really hope that these collaborations will keep coming for years to come. And then I'm really done.
Anthony, Yvonne, Steve, Mark, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very, very honored indeed that I've been asked to give this vote of thanks to Licia, who was my first PhD student who graduated. And because it's the first PhD student who became a professor, I really needed advice and help how to prepare a vote of thanks. So I did a bit of research, and there's basically guidance to say that you should start with a joke, you should be brief, and you should thank all relevant people, which I'll try to do. So I have to start with a confession. And the confession is that when Licia asked me to give this vote of thanks, I really did feel ancient, because it dawned on me that actually this young PhD student is now a professor, which means that I must be very old. But then I reflected about it for a moment and realized that actually Licia must be one of the youngest female computer science professors in the country, and then I felt better again. So as Licia said, she joined UCL this week 16 years ago. And Anthony and I had literally only a couple of years before moved to UCL, and we were still in the formative stages of forming our group, and we were particularly concerned about establishing a good social fabric. And it was good that Licia wasn't the only arrival, and there was another arrival from Politecnico di Milano. Luca came as an academic visitor, and as Anthony said, we were concerned about social fabric, and we suggested that maybe they might look for a flat together, and the rest is history. So Licia has developed, as I'm sure you will agree with me, a very enviable taste. She's been given taste literally in her cradle for very good food, and that's by virtue of being born in Emilia-Romagna. But that's not the taste I mean. She has developed taste for asking important questions and looking at these questions with very far-sighted eyes. And to this date, actually, the paper summarizing Licia's thesis that we jointly prepared is still hers and mine most widely cited paper, which is a reflection of how far-sighted her research was that she did at this very early stage. Also, her work on recommender systems has attracted quite a large number of citations, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that the work that she's now recently been working on urban computing is very significant. So when reflecting on Licia's stellar career, I think it's also time to thank a number of people. Licia has already done some of that. I think we should also thank Licia's parents, who unfortunately can't be here, but they might be watching this on a video, so I'll switch language if that's okay. Vorrei ringraziare la mamma e il padre di Licia che non sono qui oggi per il support per la Licia. It's actually not quite true that you developed the taste for research here. You would probably not have come to UCL if you hadn't been at Bologna before, and actually I think Paolo Ciaccia deserves a mention for setting you off on a path during your initial work in your master. Then I think I would like to join Licia in thanking Anthony and then subsequently John Shaw Taylor for creating the academic atmosphere and the scientific environment in which Licia was able to flourish. So Professor Capra, Licia, you've been a sometime collaborator of mine and a very long-term friend. And I look forward to watching the work that you will be undertaking and the research that you will be shaping into urban computing at UCL. Your lecture tonight gave an important insight into fundamental advances in this area. And on behalf of all of us attending, I would like to thank you for sharing these insights with us. And before we disperse, I've been asked to say that there will be drinks and nibbles outside.
Thank you.